Hello, friends! Welcome to episode 143 of Storyteller Conclave. This is a show all about helping you run the best tabletop role-playing game that you can. Whether you're a new storyteller or dungeon master learning the craft, or an experienced storyteller looking to take your game to the next level. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rob.
How we doing, Rob?
We're trying something a little different for our live listeners because we don't technically have internet at the studio, but we do have a phone and some microphones and some very crafty technology.
We do have a lot of crafty technology, so hopefully our live people are hearing us
Yes.
right now.
Yes.
And hopefully it sounds decent enough.
And I can't watch the live chat, so I'm going to leave that up to you if we kept anybody still out there. So.
Right on. So I've put the call out to ask if anybody can hear us out there. But one way or another, though, this show is getting recorded.
Yes.
It will be live the normal time. So sorry about all this. If you're hearing all this on the recording, if
the recording's bad, we're very sorry.
And apparently we are being heard.
Okay,
on the
well,
internet land. So
we will try and make for a decent show. So the topic for tonight kind of came out of left field with me and left Sarah scratching her head a little bit.
Yeah. I thought it was an interesting 15-minute discussion that turned into philosophy of role-playing 101.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So, the idea came out of, like, when does a board game become an RPG?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when are you really role-playing in a game? And for me, it's when a story is added or told in those mechanics. Now, that's kind of a generic way of looking at it.
Yeah, sure.
But, like, the box of rules doesn't necessarily have a story. Some of the more advanced board games and the more recent board games have stories, full-on stories, which I think are great.
Oh yeah, and the board game economy right now is pretty booming, especially in the last handful of years.
I would definitely say so, more so than I think it's ever had, and that's great because there's a lot more access.
Oh yeah, you head up to our FLGS, and literally they've got an entire long wall.
I would
board games.
Give it at least 100 square feet of just straight wall space that's easily 10-12 feet high of shelves. So very impressive. And there are I've seen crazy board game stores that have even more than that. But the majority of games have a basic setting, rules, and that's it. But even and I use the term when we were kids lightly, because as adults I think we do it more so, we play games and add story, add events. I know people who play the card game Smash Up, which is where you have a series of factions. I'll use the term factions loosely, like gorillas and robots and ninjas and aliens and Marvel people, or like that. And you take two of them, you smash them together, and you go against someone else to try and take over an area. And people have come up with little stories and things while that game is being played.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I personally remember from my childhood people playing the game of life, which literally kind of dictates life, but really doesn't have a story of its own, coming up with stories. I mean, the commercials had stories in them. There was clearly roles being played out there about babies being born and second babies being born and third mortgages on homes and things like that. But then you have the more meat and potatoes fantasy games like Hero Quest.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I played that a little when I was a kid. I'm sure you played it at some point.
Yeah, we did. And I want to say, actually, I might have played Hero Quest before I ever actually played real, honest-to-goodness Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Because if you remember, I've mentioned this on the show before, but my parents were not huge holy rollers into the Satanic Panic or anything like that.
Sure.
They didn't freak out, but
it came up.
They didn't mind that I was playing Palladium. They didn't mind that I was playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But then and that was okay as a role-playing game.
Yep.
But the moment I said, hey, my friend from school wants to run Dungeons and Dragons, they were like, I don't know, that's kind of evil, isn't it?
Yep. So it definitely puts a tinge on it a little bit, but you'd always come up with little stories about your character because you're playing a fighter or the ranger or whatever, right?
Knox in the box in the live chat is actually mentioning Omega Virus. So that was a board game from back in the day.
I do
where
remember it vaguely.
You were on a like a spaceship or a space station or something like that, and there was this, and it talked.
Yes.
It had this speaker in the middle, and I remember because I still to this day remember I quote it every so and then, and it would go like, "You fools! Just 5 minutes till I take over."
Right.
And like it would put the pressure on you,
Right,
you know,
right.
almost like its own automated storyteller.
Yeah, but it was things like that would give us these feelings that we were involved, that we were telling a story, and we would add things to it. I mean, I remember playing Monopoly and people getting, all kinds of into it, you can't stay at my hotel, or you owe me this because of blah, 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 and you're going to jail because, I went to jail because I couldn't pay my taxes and maybe I had some offshore accounts, but like there was all kinds of little things to that. I mean, I remember playing, what was it? Last Day on Earth, which is like a zombie game, and somebody plays the zombies and everybody else plays survivors, and that's very much that. It is, when you flub getting through to something or miss the zombies or whatever, and you're like, no, go on without me. Like, your character isn't saying that. There's nowhere in the rules that tells you to do those things. You are clearly role-playing at that point at some level. You had on here Eldritch Horror.
Eldritch Horror, yeah.
Which you love.
I absolutely adore that game. We took it up north for one of our summer trips.
Okay.
And played it with Sean and his brothers and his friend.
Yeah.
And just we went through the entire game. It was nothing but a week full of Eldritch Horror. It was great. Eldritch Horror boot camp. But the thing that I really liked about that is that you've got actual like it's all players versus the board sort of game where you're not trying to become the victor over everybody else.
Very cooperative.
Very cooperative. And you start by picking a particular character. And of course, it's Eldritch Horror is a Lovecraftian game, so it's like you've got your 1920s sort of archetypes and stuff like that. But there's no requirement to role play them. It's just that when you pick your character, you get sort of starting equipment and a special ability, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
But that kind of puts that character into a role. That you play.
Yeah. I'm feeling this.
And some of the other things that I really like doing is like You can take turns doing it, but typically, like there's a lot of decks of cards in that game, and each they have the encounters on them and the outcomes of those encounters and whatnot.
Right.
And so when somebody has to pull an encounter card, it's easier to have those cards sitting in front of one specific person who will pull them and read them.
Right.
And so I was usually that person, and I would put on a British accent and read each card individually like this.
Yes.
And it was just a lot of fun, kind of got everybody into the mood of it.
Oh yeah, totally. And that's what I'm talking about is that we're stepping away from the rules a little bit to add flavor to it, to do something different. And I think that's really kind of what brings us closer to that agency of being able to play a role and do something that affects the story and not necessarily the game itself. The game becomes just what the outcomes are, which is really no different than any other RPG as we know it today. The question then is that in the difference, and you kind of brought it up, was that it's cooperative. No one person is winning. D&D was set up with basically like the group, the team, attempting to win.
Versus the storyteller.
Who
would set, dungeon master, who would set traps and such like that and monsters out for them. And
would continue laying things
try
out.
to kill them in their giant mega dungeon.
Yeah. And that continued. I mean, that sounds like a board game because there's a outcome of winning from it based upon mechanics.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And when you consider that it had its origins in a tabletop war game, battle game, and that roleplay was tacked on kind of, I don't want to say as an afterthought, but like it was secondary to the wargaming aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, if you take that same concept and you try and put it back on board games, like you play Monopoly or Settlers and say that only one person at the time at the table could interpret the rules, and if they made a decision, that was it. No one else could change that. That was their decisional rule. you might feel a little, I don't know, off about that. It might feel a little crappy, you know?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't work going back the other direction. And most games are player versus player, not necessarily player versus table. I'm not saying like Pandemic or something like that, where it really is 100% co-op.
You go back to like Candyland or whatever. You
Yeah,
know, it's
Trouble.
It's definitely who's going to reach the end by the thing, or who's going to get the most points when the game ends.
Yeah. So really, we're talking about what bridges the two, and I think it's that cohesiveness about the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we use the word story very loosely when we're doing it with a board game. We're just kind of throwing some imagery out there to get it. But because we're locked into these mechanics, we really can't do more. Like, we're stuck with this hardened system, a clock almost, that this is how the grind works. We're just trying to cram on top of it something fun and fluffy to make it feel better.
Yeah, sure,
right?
Sure, absolutely.
So this is going to end up being a much larger discussion, not necessarily tonight, but I think it's kind of important, and that is and Sean brought this up beautifully over dinner the other night when we were talking, and that is that mechanics become the crutch for roleplay. Like, you can't do things without them in some systems. And you see this happen more and more. And we look at role-playing games through a different lens than we do board games, but in many times we tend to treat that like a board game.
Oh, sure.
We force that window and try to cram the terms of balance and rule sets.
Yeah, your mechanics are going to dictate your roleplay in a lot of ways, whether you want them to or not.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of where they become a crutch for role plays, because rather than freely role playing in them and using the mechanics to adjudicate certain outcomes, a lot of people will look at their sheet and look at the rules and say, well, what can I do?
Exactly. Like, what are my moves becomes a question. What do I do next? The brain is still attached to what are my steps of play as a player in this board game.
Exactly.
I mean, I used to hear that all the time when I would bring people into D&D. Like, well, what do I do? Well, what do you want to do? No, I don't know what my actions are. What can I do? Mm-hmm. You know, they're trying to board gamify.
Well, sure. And I think part of that definitely comes from the analysis paralysis, especially for new players, of like being told you can do anything is a far too vast of a chasm of possibility for a lot of people. And so you wanted something a little more control, because at least if I say, okay, you can roll the dice to attack, they know how that works now.
Right.
You know,
right. There's a process to complete that.
But giant air quotes, anything is a little too nebulous to kind of grasp.
Well, I mean, you even brought it up when we were talking about systems and initiative. Like, your brain was attached to initiative, so when a system comes to you and says, we just kind of go into combat, you're like,
oh yeah,
what?
Like Powered by the Apocalypse. I'm reading through what was it, Urban Shadows,
yeah,
and I'm like, oh wow, I really like how the flow of this game goes, but like, how do you decide who goes first? Who gets initiative, who goes first? Like, if somebody says, well, I lash out physically, okay, cool, obviously you're initiating that, so probably you'd go first, but then like, how do you determine who else in that, so you don't get a bunch of people at the table shouting, well, I do this. Okay, you got to have some sort of a turn order. Right? There's no initiative system in Urban Shadows.
No.
And I still, to this day, don't know what to do with that.
Right, your brain wants to set some rules in place to handle that. And some people do. Like, there are definitely there's definitely some homebrew or discussionary topics about that, but like, we've stepped away from that by going into that system. I mean, it's funny that simple act, that simple thing, draws us right back to that basic feeling of like, how does order come into this?
Well, for me though, like, okay, so I'm sure you've had tables where this has happened, and I may have even contributed to this in the past. I try not to be this person, but where you get the villain, you want to do something. You're doing a reveal. You're doing a hard move sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the villain is, monologuing, and he's like, and now, and you get about halfway through that sentence, and 3 of your 4 players shout out, "I shoot him in the head," or something like that.
Right.
And they want to interrupt him. They want to be the first person to get the drop, so he doesn't do
Right.
the thing that he is set up to do. So he doesn't make that hard move.
Right.
And your response to that as a storyteller is then going to be, okay, roll initiative. And if you roll high enough, maybe you'll get to
Do that.
do the thing before he's able to push the button or whatever.
Right.
But if not, if you don't have an initiative system, do you just tell your players, like, sit down and shut up, I'm not done monologuing? I mean, to be nice about it,
To
but,
be nice about it.
But what do you do at that point? And that's what went through my brain, was like,
Right.
okay, I lash out physically. Well, then the villain, and I'm halfway through the sentence of the villain, returns fire, or the villain does this, or the villain does that, and having 3 of my 4 players all shouting actions at me, trying to, interrupt the villain.
Right.
Without an initiative system, what do you do?
Right. But at the same time, it's that it is a social contract. It's a roundabout, It's that thing where there has to be at least some level of social understanding. So,
yeah, absolutely. And the other big thing for like mechanics enforcing or dictating role play.
Ooh, yeah.
Like, how often have you seen the big dumb fighter?
Lots.
I mean, lots,
Yeah.
right? So think about why that is. Is that because the big dumb fighter is a common player choice? Or is it because, just mechanically speaking, fighters require high strength, high constitution, high dexterity, but they do not require high intelligence, high charisma, high wisdom. Intelligence becomes what we all colloquially call a dump stat,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's not needed for your character. But mechanically, the other stats are. And so you always end up with this trope of the big dumb fighter, because mechanically, especially if you're using a point pie or a standard array, you can't afford to put a high stat in your intelligence.
No, it's true.
The game doesn't allow you to. And so you end up with this prevalence of the big dumb fighter archetype simply because smart fighter isn't on the menu.
Well, and it's not necessary. Like, one of the things that I have witnessed over and over again, reading through Reddit articles and stories and watching things on YouTube and people, the challenge ratings for intelligence checks, charisma checks, wisdom checks are about 1/10 of the checks at most in a D&D game. The rest of them are all going to be con, strength, and charisma check, and dexterity checks, or related to those in some way, whether it's AC or strength versus strength, or saving versus death kind of things.
Yeah, sure.
So why would you even want to do that? Because mechanically, it doesn't make sense if the story never gets to that point.
Right.
And you and I both know this, when people ask for lore, or someone asks for knowledge, or someone tries to do a check, and you're like, make a roll, there's only one person in the party who's going to make that check traditionally, and it's the person who's going to always pass it. And it's not like the party needs to do an arcane check, like in fighting. It's one. You might have stealth, but again, that's dexterity.
Yeah.
You know? And that is the part that really distances us away from mechanics and why it makes it a hindrance. And don't tell me that we haven't in the past, both of us, done the mistake of, I go and try and seduce the guard, to letting us in to the party. Okay, well, what do you tell him? Stop right there. You've made the mistake.
Yep.
We're playing D&D. They roll.
Yep.
You failed. Okay, here's the outcome. What was your approach? I attempt to seduce the guard. Great. Let's make a performance check, or or charm, or however you're planning on doing it. Oh, it succeeded. He seems like he knows you. That's the appropriate response.
Yeah.
You know, how does he know you? You know, and instead we try and, you know, use the role-playing outside of the rule set, the mechanics that are set forth to handle intelligence and wisdom and charisma, which are stats. Like mechanics within the game, which we shouldn't be doing, and yet we step away from them. We step away from the mechanics to do these.
Yeah.
All the time. So it's a crutch. Like, we are literally hampering ourselves constantly in systems that have these mechanics.
The charisma one's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because I feel like the crux of this discussion is we want to try to get away from the board gamey mechanical aspects of things to allow freedom in roleplay.
Mm-hmm.
But like that whole charisma seduction thing is one where you actually want to go back.
Yes.
To the rules, because it doesn't work the other way around.
It's exceptionally hard the other way around.
Well, I mean, okay, it does work. It can lead to a lot of misunderstandings.
Well, social things in general are hard. Just as hard as trying to explain a riddle to someone who isn't getting the aesthetic of what you're trying to apply.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might be trying to push, you know, the riddle of, you know, the three turtles at someone, right? And they're just not getting it, and you're like, a 3-year-old could solve this riddle. Like, why is this so challenging for them? Why are they doing, you know, pulling up Pythagorean's theorem, you know, trying to figure it out?
Maybe it's base 8 math.
Exactly. Like, no, this is simple. And yet, that's just an intelligence check, really.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or, you know, as a elf, am I aware of any other elven tombs that might be in this area? Well, you're an elf. You're 250 years old. So you're pretty old for an elf even. Yeah, you probably do know things. Great. Is it a check or not? Mm-hmm. That's the question. Is it part of the story? Does it change? Is it a challenge? And that's when things really start getting different. And so, do you give your players who are not capable as a player over the capabilities of their character a chance to meet a challenge? That's the part where I think where we're connecting on that.
Oh, yeah,
is where that mechanic makes sense to keep in under those things. And that's where mechanics can help.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, no, it's not balanced, even in its own system.
Mm-hmm.
Ever. Really. But I don't want to lean into that discussion. I think we have a whole story to go over with mechanics. But what I'm getting at with this is that as we start breaking down the mechanical rules, we start getting closer and closer to the raw roleplay, where it is more about social contract and less about the mechanics of the rules.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, you were talking about Powered by the Apocalypse. Most of the games that I've ever witnessed by Power Apocalypse aren't shouting matches about who goes next.
No, and that's I think what that game system does really well about fostering that sort of environment. Like in my brain, like I've had that happen at my table where everybody starts shouting like, "Oh, I shoot the villain before he ever touches the button," and without an initiative system, that's difficult to adjudicate unless you've got some trust at the table, which you really should have some trust at the table, you know.
I mean, I go back to our Mouse Guard game.
Yeah, exactly.
When have we ever dealt with initiative in the Mouse Guard game?
And I go back to even my last Savage Worlds game, where I had 3 different groups trying to split the party 3 different ways, so I just dealt out cards.
Yeah.
And we did a simple initiative order for your scenes.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And then Sean's character at one point was just trying to make an aggressive move against somebody in a social scene.
Right.
The man laid hands on him and he had to be put down. So
yep.
I was like, okay, I just want to make sure that you can act before he can counter that. And so I just drew 2 cards.
Yep.
Sean drew higher. So yeah, that guy's butt landed on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But there's simple in-game ways of using the mechanics that are handed to you to handle those sort of things.
Right. And I think in some cases where that becomes a need, that is where those mechanics are helping everyone at the table feel comfortable with the contract. You know, they're adding a physicality to it in a way that helps everyone especially the people who are uncomfortable feel more comfortable because they now know they have something to look back upon.
Right, right.
So,
Knox in the Box in the live chat is saying, says, I don't know, don't you not fail in a game like Mouse Guard, but just succeed or move forward in different ways? So maybe it's not just the failure, but checks with the function of choosing the path for the outcome. Let me see if I'm reading this correctly. So maybe not just failure, but checks with the function of choosing the path for the outcome, no matter if they're equal or not.
Okay, I'm kind of picking up on that. Mouse Guard is a different system in the way that the mechanics work. There is no real fail. That is true. It is the story continues, even if like you critically make a mistake. And I use the word mistake to mean like, yeah, you might get injured, you might lose your tail, or have an eye scarred, or lose a tip of your ear, or possibly, if you choose, die.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sure, your mouse can die, but it's more about the story continuing than anything else. That's what it's leaning into, and the consequences come to a group discussion of the story. So that is part of the contract that is within that game, is that it's an understanding that everyone is there to continue the story as a whole, not to Mary Sue a heroic, ridiculous story because you only want to succeed.
Right, and I think that's really where it comes down to. I don't think it's a matter of Mouse Guard not having failure, therefore we don't fight over the initiative order. I don't think it's about stakes. I think it's just about the social contract. Like, neither of us are there to step on each other's tails, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that we're either all going to succeed together or we're all going to fail together.
I think,
but one way or another, though, the story is going to continue, and I don't think that. I think the social contract at our Mouse Guard table is such that we all want everyone else at that table to get the limelight for an appropriate amount of time, and to do the thing that their character's good at, pass or fail, and whether they, and tell a good story while we're at it. And so we don't need to fight over initiative order because it's not about getting a one-up on everybody else. In fact, it's a lot more often about passing the spotlight to somebody else.
Yes, I think that is very true for especially for our game.
I mean, if in getting back to our Mouse Guard game, like my character's a Master Pathfinder, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Every single pathfinding roll is most optimally done by my character who has 5 points in pathfinding.
Without a doubt.
How often do I do the pathfinding rolls? 1 in 3 times?
Maybe, if that.
Because I've got a Tenderpaw who I'm trying to mentor.
Correct.
So I like letting my Tenderpaw or your Tenderpaw, who's a cartographer.
Yeah, agreed.
I like letting them do it because that's not like I already know I'm good at it. I don't need to prove I'm a Master Pathfinder. I've got other things to do. Let the kids do it. Let them have their moment in the sun. And I think it's more about passing a spotlight to tell the story about it rather than trying to hog it ourselves.
Correct. And that's where the game mechanics kind of let you know via story.
Mm-hmm.
You're here to bring up other people. That's part of who you are. And for that reason, Mouse Guard is an exceptionally different game in comparison to any tabletop game.
Yeah, it's a pretty big departure from the board gaminess of like I have to win.
I almost feel, and we've said this before a couple times, that Mouse Guard is an ideal system for role play.
It really is, yeah.
Because it puts everything in the right perspective for role play.
Mm-hmm.
It spells out the mechanics for storytelling as a group.
Yeah.
Which is something that systems don't necessarily ignore, but never hit that chord. They get close.
I had a happy moment, I think, that fits this this line of thinking as well with Savage Worlds the other day.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're talking about this outside of the show over dinner the other night.
You'll have to bring me back into check.
It was a Reddit thread, and this was kind of where Sean's balance as a crutch discussion came up.
Okay.
But I'm not going that direction with it. But the Reddit thread was basically about in Savage Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
It said that the rate of fire rules are broken.
That's what it was.
And I was like, okay, what's your take on this? So I clicked on the thread, and it was like, okay, well, if you buy a saw, which is a type of light machine gun,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you get a light machine gun, which has got like 200 rounds or something like that.
Sure.
It does like 2d8 damage per round, and with the rate of fire rules, and if you take 2 very specific edges, basically turn 1 of combat, you drop prone, which is a free move, and then you can fire off 5 shots at no recoil penalty, each doing 2d8 damage or something like that, which is quite a bit in Savage Worlds.
Especially in Savage Worlds, yeah.
Which is quite a bit in Savage Worlds. Yeah. And it will only consume like 1/5 of your total ammunition to fire off these 5 shots per round.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do this 5 rounds in a row with absolutely no recoil penalties.
Okay.
Exactly. And so like from the D&D mentality and from the board gamey mentality.
Yeah.
Of like, this needs to be balanced. All these game rules need to not allow for overpowered Mary Sue combos.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that looks like a very scary thing of like, oh my goodness, this guy can just drop so much damage in one turn. And the responses that I saw in that thread were perfect.
Mm-hmm.
The response overwhelmingly was, yeah, and?
Mm-hmm.
Good for him. They spent a bunch of money on a machine gun, and they spent their characters' advances on the edges to be able to use it well. Good, let them blow stuff up.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, but you don't think it's over? Well, no, because your story isn't just about how much damage you can do in a turn.
Yep.
Like, if it becomes about how much damage, like if they're fighting some gigantic mecha or something like that, or like a dragon, or I don't know what else.
I'm immediately seeing like the Mummy with the machine gun against a bunch of undead.
Right.
Sure, great,
and then
wonderful.
Somebody else was like, well, it's not balanced. I mean, you can't get a pistol user to do that same amount of damage. No, you shouldn't get a pistol user to do the same amount of damage as someone trained in a light machine gun.
Yeah. Expertly trained in a light machine gun.
A 200-round belt feed mag of 7.62s should not...
Arnold Schwarzenegger will win.
Yeah.
The Terminator in the window with the minigun will
Jesse
win.
Ventura in Predator, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's just about the idea that if you're just leaning on mechanics, okay? If you're just treating this like a board game with win conditions... Mm-hmm. That looks like they have found the cheat codes to the win condition.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you extrapolate that into roleplay, the moment you extrapolate that into story, and you abstract that situation into something that needs to be interacted with from multiple different avenues, with multiple different characters and stuff like that, suddenly that character just becomes man with gun.
Mm-hmm.
And if man with gun is not the solution to your problem, that character doesn't do much now.
But
they're still a man.
They can still communicate.
They can still
come up with ideas and things like that.
Absolutely.
And sure, that's your ability. Great.
But
wonderful.
But when you take it up to that role play level, and now we're telling a story, you know, unless you're literally trying to put as much damage as possible into a target, you're not the strongest person on the board.
No.
If it's a negotiation, the strongest person on the board is the one with the highest persuasion skill.
Mm-hmm.
If it's an investigation, the strongest person on the board is the person with the highest research skill or highest notice skill.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like, congratulations on your machine gun, though.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I think I love about...
Excuse me.
The more you move from board game style rules into the RP space and stuff like that, you start finding that there are other avenues to win the game than what is put before you, obviously.
Well, and use the term win lightly.
Yeah, and I use it very lightly because I use it in the term of like a personal victory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, for me, winning the game is knowing my friends are safe, knowing that the villain has been thwarted at the end of the day.
That you escaped. Whatever, you completed the goal.
And that I did something cool. For me, like in your game.
Yeah.
You know what one of my win conditions in your game is?
Oh.
That I get to pull off my combo.
Okay.
Cone of Cold into Shatter.
That's right.
That's all I want. I just think it looks cool aesthetically.
That is pretty cool.
It's Shiva from Final Fantasy X, if you remember that animation.
No, I distinctly remember that. And then I think of Mad Elf. Mm-hmm. He just wants to put his template down. He just wants to put that template down.
The center of the fireball goes here. Man, as long as he gets to light someone on fire every other game, he's happy.
His character's
just happy.
In pure bliss in regards to that. And I think that is where we still kind of circulate back to mechanics and firepower. Mm-hmm. And we don't see the other wins, the other
facets,
goals, the other facets.
Yeah.
But I think it's neat that if you distill things down, some of the finest role play that we've seen, and I'm going to put it out there, Dread. Yeah. Dread has the simplest mechanics and some of the most complex role play.
For those of you not remembering Dread, I know we've talked about it a lot on the show, but I also know that this is episode 143, so I don't hold all of you to knowing our entire library. Dread is played with a Jenga tower.
Yep.
It's a game of survival horror. When a check is needed, you don't have stats, you don't have dice, you don't have anything like that.
Nope.
You all communally are using the same Jenga tower, so every time somebody else makes a check, it makes failure more inevitable for everybody else.
Yep.
And you pull a block.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you can pull that block and place that block per the rules of Jenga, then you have succeeded, and you get to continue. However, if that tower falls at any time, the last person to have touched the tower is removed from the story in a way that is thematically appropriate. Either they are killed by the monster, or go, mad and go raving off into the night, never to be seen again.
Or are injured and left.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Whatever way is thematically appropriate to remove them from the story at that moment.
Yep.
That's how it is. And then you rebuild the tower, you remove a handful of blocks, and you start over again.
You continue the story.
Yeah. But I think kind of getting to the point of what we're getting at here is that I think this was the thesis statement for me. This was the thing that really made this whole discussion click for me, is that you said, think about how pure role play of an experience that is.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay. And you went, if you muted the audio on a game of Dread, all you're watching is a slow-mo game of Jenga.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh wow, holy crap.
Mm-hmm.
It's just nothing but a slow-mo game of Jenga. Yeah. And extrapolate that to all the other games that you know. 5th edition D&D. All you've got is a tactical combat game. It's Final Fantasy Tactics.
Yeah.
Is all.
Yep.
It's actually remarkably close to Final Fantasy Tactics in its execution.
Very much so. A very slow game of that.
Slow game, yeah. But it is.
Yeah.
It's the role play that kind of elevates it out of board game and brings it to the tabletop, brings it to our imaginations, brings it to the story. But then you kind of flip that around on its edge.
Mm-hmm.
What is stopping you from playing the game of life by Mattel or whatever that the company is? Parker Brothers.
Yeah. I don't know who owns it anymore. So.
By Parker Brothers and role playing each and every move on that. Is it more of a pure role playing game if it uses dice instead of that little spinner thingy?
Mm-hmm.
Is it more of a role-playing game if it uses dice instead of cards or a Jenga tower?
Well, and here's the thing is that I think the dice or whatever also imparts a sense of success or consequence. Like, that little edge of, we've all felt it, where that variety, that moment that you are close to something, you roll a 14 when you need a 15, and everybody goes, oh, and it has that, like, oh, God, it was so close. That variant, that minor thing, tells us something about the level of success in our heads immediately, you know, or you roll a 1. Ooh. Like, even if it doesn't have a consequence in the mechanics, we still feel it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? It's a thing, you know?
It's almost Pavlovian.
Right. I mean, and that's true for any game. I don't care if you're playing craps, you know, that has no role-playing imparted upon it because it's literally gambling, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But you still have that sense, that struggle, that anticipation, you know, that comes along with it, that adds that flavor, and then that is then accelerated into role-play, into theater, if you will. So it almost grants the players the ability to explain the moment, or grants the storyteller the ability to explain that moment in more detail of how close is close. You know, what does close look like? It's something that is not deliberate anywhere. And I went looking in role-playing game rules for that. For the close calls. There's nothing.
Yeah, so many of them are pass-fail.
It is just pass-fail. We as players and storytellers add that. It tells you exactly what happens when a 1 occurs on a specific roll. Or when you don't make the DC. You take the damage, or you take half the damage, right? Those are the types of things that are written in the guides. It doesn't tell you that if you didn't make it by 1, your character deftly tried to, you know, was just not dexterous enough to get out. That's not there. There's not even anything in the DM's guide that explains the role-playing aspects of that in D&D.
Yeah, it's just like, it does 2d6 damage and half if you make your dex save.
Right. There's nothing that talks about the flavor at all. All of that flavor that we're adding, that drama, that edge of theater, that the imagery, the social edge to it, all of that is added after the fact. Outside of the rules 100%. And gives the sense of roleplay, gives the sense of drama and theater within it.
And the more and more I think about that, the more the question rolls around in the back of my mind of why do we need the rules at all?
That is where we come back to the social contract aspect.
Right.
We as people have 2 things going for us. We haven't died in enough car accidents.
Okay.
And I say that funnily in a way that we all have rules for the road. We go, we get licensed, we know what those rules are, and then just like D&D, we never look at the rules book again, and we completely forget that they're there, or that the rules have changed over multiple versions.
We hand a 1/4-ton weapon to a teenager.
To a teenager,
Yeah.
and then tell them when they're 40, they're still doing it okay as long as the GM hasn't pulled them over, right? But there's a constant social contract that when I'm doing 70 miles an hour on a freeway, you know, or 100 kilometers per hour, that the guy in the vehicle next to me isn't just going to slam into my vehicle. Or drive the wrong direction because he likes this side of the road better than the other. Okay? But we also have that as a written rule somewhere. We know it.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
Right? You stay on your side, I stay on my side. There's no rule that says specifically when you cross it, it just says you're out of bounds. That's all it says. Right? But that's how we handle life. In role-playing, we do the same thing. There are other social norms that don't fit the rules. The question is how much framework do we need before the social contract holds tight? And I think the truth of the matter is it comes down to your table.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the answer to that question really depends on your group.
Yep.
Because you're going to end up with groups like we have, you know, where I can deal out just a couple cards and say, okay, your card is higher than their card, you go first. And the people who just who now have to wait, 20 minutes for you guys to complete your scene, go, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. And they fold their hands and they quietly and patiently listen, and they're involved in the story. They're paying attention and stuff. Mm-hmm. They're happy for you when you have your victory, and then it comes to their turn, and you guys wait patiently.
Yep.
Or, though, you end up with a table where people need to be reminded of the social contract, or who will actively try to break the social contract.
Or who are too impatient.
Or who are too impatient, who want to try to use and manipulate the game system, or even the other people at the table to try to do that. So, your flexibility with the social contract is really going to depend on your table. Mm-hmm. It's really going to depend on...
and it's funny, we use terms like power gaming and rules lawyering.
Yeah.
And bullying, table bullying. I've definitely heard that a few times. What was it? Anti-heroing. Where you have somebody at the table who is there for themselves. Mm-hmm. They're not there for anyone else. They're there to play the game and win the game themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have their own story, their own agenda. This is their game. Well, I'm just playing the game. No. You're playing your own game. You're ignoring the rest of the table. This is now a personal story, your own novel. You should go write it. Mm-hmm. Just go. And you end up getting Mary Sue's out of that. The impossibly perfect situation where nothing bad can happen at it. And that's the variant point. I think that's the hard variant point that really defines board game versus role play. And I see it all the time. You look at Reddit and you look at people who are talking about a player who is doing something that is against the social contract, and the game master storyteller is asking, how do I handle this player with this X situation, which is clearly one of the defined terms?
Sure.
The answer is, they're not playing a role-playing game. Mm-hmm. They are not cooperative. They're not trying to cooperatively tell the story. Either mentally they're not prepared for it, or they're actively deciding that they don't want to do that. They want to play a board game, a tactical board game where they can win over the other players.
Exactly.
And that's where this kind of came to a head for me, was that the rules are there only so long as they are necessary outside of the social contract and can help the story be told in a fun, dramatic, and entertaining way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Because realistically, beyond that, the mechanics, like we said, are kind of pointless.
Yeah.
Because you can do it with dread.
If you can adjudicate a game with a Jenga tower, you can adjudicate a game with anything. I mean, heck, look at Amber.
Oh, God. Freaking Amber.
Amber doesn't even have a Jenga tower.
Doesn't even have a Jenga tower. Just has a lot of dominating people.
I mean, we've already done the diceless game. I mean, it may be cutthroat, but it's still a diceless game,
Yeah.
And as long as everybody's adhering to the social contract, you can absolutely play it.
100%. 100% agree with you. And, for me, and I was saying this earlier when we were coming up with the sheet and we were talking about this, was that as you and I, doing these shows, have come through these 142 episodes.
Yeah.
And our years of roleplay before that, and screwing things up and running terrible games and horrific stories that we're like, why did we do this?
Sure.
And I'm saying session to session. Whole storylines, probably pretty cool at times, but in some cases a session was like, yeah, it's a bad idea.
Yeah, man.
We have come to this point where we are having this better understanding for ourselves of what role play and storytelling is, and how to extract that from what we know as tabletop role play to this is role play. This is at its purest form and the necessary components if you want success. And we're doing our best to try and put it out there, but we're still learning and discovering, and I feel great about it. I love that.
Yeah,
like it's wonderful when I can find a moment of like, oh boy, and it's not so much the light comes on, but it's more like the light comes on in the closet that I just realized I found, and I'm like, there's a lot more in this room,
Yeah.
and it's exciting in a way.
Yeah, for me, that's usually every show topic for me.
You find something.
I find a little something. There are show topics. Like this one in general. This one specifically. We jotted it down on our list of planned shows, and I was like, okay, well, it's just something that. Rob obviously has some opinions of. I'm not sure I have a lot of opinions on this one, but okay, sure. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I jotted down like I think one or two little things or something like that, or I was going to. I didn't even get around. I didn't even put them on the sheet, and I was like, yeah, I kind of want to talk to you because like I could only come up with like one or two things. And then 45 minutes later, we're having Role-Playing Philosophy 101.
It's true.
And I'm like, oh, I see the structure of everything. I can see the matrix. Yeah.
Yeah. It's cool.
But there's been a lot of shows like that for me where I started out by jotting down so dice are fun to play with, and then clicky clocky math rocks. And 45 minutes later I'm like picking apart
mathematics
and player incentives and psychology behind doing certain things in your role-playing game, and it's good when that happens.
No, I like it a lot. So, and it's why next month we are going to try and continue our Storytelling 101. One of the things we are doing I think next month's topic is the concept to campaign.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
it's how to turn your idea,
which we talked about last month,
for your story. So
month.
we talked about inspiration. Like, yes. Where do you get your ideas from? Okay, right. So you've got an idea. What do you do with it now?
Right.
How do you turn that idea into a game you can pitch to your friends?
Yeah.
How do you decide on mechanics? How do you decide on players? How do you decide how that story is going to unfold?
Mm-hmm. How far do you go with that story?
Like, how do you form your group?
Yeah.
Do you put any restrictions on your group?
Yeah.
How are you? And we're going to take you basically to the point where you are at a session 0, getting ready to gear up and start that campaign. So you can find us on Twitter at @ST_Conclave, on Instagram at @ST_Conclave. Listen to us live every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time at mixlr.com/storyteller-conclave, at least when we're not having massive internet issues.
Very true.
And join us on Discord. You can find the link up on our Twitter, and you can also find that on our website, storytellerconclave.com.
We'd like to thank our Patreon members, Knox in the Box, Sam, the Arcane Asylum, Sparkle Motion, Veteran, Hulavu. Those name members and others, we thank you every month for your support. It truly helps us keep everything going here. Our pre-show music, which you didn't hear today, is by Arcane Anthems. You can find them at patreon.com/Arcane Anthems. Our intro music, and if you're hearing this on the normal recording, is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. You can find them at geefrog.bandcamp.com or on Google Music. And our outro music, which you're probably hearing right now, is Only Our Footprints in the Sand by Midair Machine. You can find them at freemusicarchive.org.
And a big shout out as always to our families, Vicky and Sean. Thank you so much for loving and supporting us.
Vicky, thank you for finding these mics and this system to be able to have us do this when we don't have internet.
All of our friends who've sat with us at our tables over the years to share these great stories with you, and you, every single one of our listeners, we love you so much.
Love you.
Good night.
Good night.